Good evening, and welcome back to another relaxing story of survival. Tonight, we're going to explore something quiet, cold, and deeply human. The kind of night where the world narrows to a small circle of warmth, surrounded by endless winter. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, have you ever been stuck in snow so deep it felt like the sky itself was pressing down? Maybe your car skidded in a storm, or you once walked through drifts so tall they swallowed the horizon. Share your story below. And don't forget to like the video if you enjoy what we do here, and subscribe for more survival stories. Because tonight's story asks you to imagine a world where the snowfall never quite stopped. Hours, then days, then a full week of relentless white. Wind carving waves into the drifts. Trees bowing under the weight. Roads vanishing. Landmarks erased. And you moving through that quiet desert of winter, trying to stay one step ahead of a storm that seemed to breathe. You'd been traveling alone, keeping to the forest trails that curled along the eastern ridge. Your goal wasn't complicated. Reach the old ranger station before the worst of the blizzard arrived. But storms don't wait for plans. They don't pause for tired legs or fading daylight. They simply build and break. By mid-afternoon, the sky had gone the color of steel. Snow swept sideways, sharp as sand. The wind rose in long, mournful cries that echoed through the firs. Your pace slowed. Every step felt heavier than the last. You kept your hood low, your breath measured, your thoughts steady. But even the best planning has limits. Halfway across a frozen clearing, visibility collapsed to a single arm's length. Snow fell so thick you could hear it pattering against your coat. Within minutes, the drift line climbed your shins, then your knees. You were no longer walking across the landscape. The landscape was swallowing you. That was when you spotted it. A shallow depression near the base of a bent spruce. Not a cave, not a cabin, but the hint of shelter. A hollow dug by wind and time, deep enough to crawl into. It wasn't much, but it was something. And when nature closes in, you take what it gives. You dropped to your hands and knees, pulled yourself into the drift, and realized the hollow opened into a pocket beneath 10 feet, maybe 3 meters, of packed snow. A natural dugout, reinforced by the trunk's heavy limbs. Safe from the wind, muffled from the storm, hidden from the wrath of the sky. Here, the world felt still. But snow is both a shield and a danger. Dugouts like this can collapse, suffocating with their weight. Air can run thin. Cold can seep into bone. You reminded yourself of these truths even as you settled in, because survival is as much about awareness as it is about action. You checked the ceiling. Thick, compact, stable for now. You tapped the hard snow with your gloves, solid. You cleared a small breathing gap, making sure fresh air continued to drift through the natural vents between branches. You confirmed your exit path stayed passable. Then, slowly, you let yourself breathe. Slow, deep, calm. Outside, the storm tore across the forest like an ancient beast. Inside, everything softened. The snow absorbed sound until even your heartbeat felt like a whisper. The dim light that filtered through the walls glowed pale blue, like moonlight underwater. You listened to it all, the wind, the shifting branches, the distant groan of ice, and let the world settle. You weren't trapped, you were waiting. And this is how the night began. The storm deepened. Hours drifted by like falling flakes. Time lost shape inside the snow, bending and stretching until it became something soft, something slower than waking life. You adjusted your coat, repositioned your pack beneath you, and wrapped your scarf higher across your cheeks. Fatigue tugged at your eyes, but you resisted sleep. Not yet. Not while the world outside roared strong enough to bury any carelessness. The dugout breathed with you. Every few minutes, a faint draft slipped along the walls, carrying the crisp scent of winter. You monitored those tiny changes the way a sailor watches the tide. When shelter is borrowed from nature, you treat it with reverence. Your mind wandered to the world beyond the storm. The distant road buried, the ridge trails invisible, the sky sealed behind the shifting white. You wondered how many others were bracing through nights like this, tucked in cabins, leaning against stalled cars, huddling beneath tarps or behind wind-bent trees. Winter tests everyone differently. You reached for your headlamp, clicked it on, and let its muted glow fill the small chamber. Its beam illuminated the curved walls, smooth as carved stone. Snow shelters like this can be deceptively warm, insulation trapping body heat, snow acting as a silent guardian. Inuit hunters understood this, building igloos that held warmth even in the hardest Arctic nights. Still, you knew the risk. Snow dens, if built wrong or left unattended, could collapse under shifting weight. Carbon dioxide could build in a closed space. Moisture from exhaled breath could weaken the ceiling. Safety required vigilance. So you scraped a small ventilation hole with the tip of your trekking pole. You reinforced the entrance with packed snow, making sure it stayed open but stable. You checked your footing. You listened for subtle cracks, the kind that warn of shifting layers overhead. Everything remained still. With precautions set, you allowed yourself to embrace the shelter fully. You pulled your pack closer, took a drink from your insulated bottle, and let the warmth spread through your chest. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, your breath fogged gently in the lamplight. The snow glowed around you like a cathedral of ice, soft, silent, almost sacred. Hours continued to pass, but the storm showed no mercy. The blizzard hammered the ridge, piling weight upon the world. You knew travel was impossible until morning, assuming the storm even stopped by then. So you rested. You slipped into a calm rhythm of observation and stillness. Listening, breathing, dozing lightly without falling fully asleep. Conservation of energy mattered now. Movement burned heat, and heat was your lifeline. You sat with your thoughts, letting them drift toward memories of summers long past. Sunlight on the river, warm grass beneath your hands, the way the horizon shimmered in July. These memories warmed the mind, and sometimes that mattered as much as warming the body. The storm became a lullaby, fierce but strangely comforting. You closed your eyes and allowed the rhythm of winter to move around you. You were not lost. You were sheltered. A distant, cracking sound snapped you awake. For a moment, you didn't move. You just listened, spine straight, breath shallow, instincts sharpened. Snow shifts for countless reasons. Settling layers, wind pressure, distant trees shedding weight. But a survivalist learns to hear the difference between harmless movement and immediate danger. You tilted your head, listened again. Silence. The lamp flickered gently in your gloved hand, illuminating the fine frost gathering at the ceiling. You reached upward, pressing your palm lightly against the compacted snow. Solid. Cold. No new fissures, no sagging shape, just the natural groaning of a forest under strain. Still, you widened the ventilation gap by another inch. Better airflow meant safer breathing, and it reduced risk of melting a weak spot overhead with trapped warmth. Then, slowly, you allowed your tension to settle. The night outside was entering its deepest hour. The wind lost some of its sharpness, softening to long exhalations that swept over the treetops. Each gust shifted the light filtering through the wall, making the snow glow and dim like a breathing creature. Here, time worked differently. Every sound felt amplified. Every silence felt ancient. You checked your supplies, careful, deliberate movements, emergency blanket, fire starter, rations, heat packs, knife, saw, compact shovel, everything in its place. Everything familiar. The storm's fury kept you pinned, but you weren't powerless. Good preparation turns fear into strategy. You reached for your small stove, its metal cool beneath your fingers. You didn't plan to run it long. Flames in tight shelters require constant supervision, but a brief moment of warmth mattered. Something hot in your core could make the next stretch of night easier. You lit a tiny flame, sheltered by your gloved hands, and heated a small pot of snow. As it melted, the chamber filled with the faint scent of metal and steam. You poured the warm water into your insulated bottle. The heat against your palms steadied you. You breathed deeper, slower. The wind rose again, rattling branches above the ceiling. Snow dust drifted through the vent like tiny stars, and somewhere in the forest, a long howl echoed. Not a threat, just a distant call, a creature riding out the night in its own way. Everything alive must find shelter eventually, even the predators. You imagined wolves curled in a den of branches, owls tucked beneath heavy boughs, deer pressing close to the lee of a ridge to escape the wind. You belonged to that same quiet community tonight, all creatures enduring the same storm, each in their separate pockets of safety. The heat from your bottle warmed your gloves. You set it inside your jacket and let it rest against your chest. Gradually, tension eased. The cracking sound earlier revealed itself to be nothing more than the deep winter working through its cycles. Snow settling, trees shifting, ice breathing beneath layers of cold. You exhaled, allowed calm to return. And the night moved on. When you opened your eyes next, the lamp had grown dim. Your breath made soft clouds in the chilled air. Something had changed. The storm had eased. You could feel it before you heard it. The pressure on the snow walls lightened. The air tasted less sharp. And amid the silence, the faintest hint of dawn crept through the ceiling in pale blue. You shifted upright, muscles stiff from hours of careful stillness. A shelter like this demands respect. One careless turn in sleep could weaken a wall or disrupt airflow. It had been a night of half-rest, drifting between dreams and vigilance. But you'd made it through the worst. Outside, the wind lingered, but its fury had broken. You crawled to the entrance, testing every inch of the passage. Snow shelters can freeze closed if ignored. Ice forms quickly. Drifts creep silently. But the path remained open, compressed but intact. You peered through the opening. The world beyond was unrecognizable. White stretched endlessly in all directions. Drifts curled like frozen waves. Trees bent low under the weight, their branches heavy with ice. The storm had sculpted the landscape into a silent ocean of winter. You pulled yourself halfway out of the dugout, letting the cold morning air wash over your face. It stung at first, then steadied. Fresh, clean, filled with the promise of quiet after chaos. Your shelter, your temporary sanctuary, looked smaller from the outside. A subtle indentation beneath deep snow, hidden from anyone who didn't know where to look. In the right conditions, it could save a life. In the wrong ones, it could become a trap. You whispered a quiet warning to anyone who might stumble into such a place unprepared. Always know the risks. Always test the ceiling. Always build airflow. Never assume snow is stable. And never rely solely on a dugout for long-term shelter. It is survival, not comfort. You scanned the sky. Clouds drifted in tatters, revealing a thin line of dawn. Pale yellow seeped upward like watercolor on paper. You felt its warmth long before you saw the sun. You retreated into the shelter to collect your gear. Organized, efficient, moving slowly to maintain heat. Your bottle was still warm. Your scarf held the faint smell of melted snow. Your gloves felt stiff but reliable. And then, with a final glance at the curved chamber that had hosted your breathing through the darkest hours, you turned toward the waking world. The forest waited. The first steps out of the dugout were heavy, each one sinking deep into the fresh snow. The drifts rose past your knees, soft on top but dense beneath. You tightened your pack straps and leaned forward, using controlled, deliberate strides. This is how winter travel works after a storm. Slow, steady, aware of the hidden shapes below. Light filtered gently through the trees, turning ice crystals into tiny prisms. Your breath trailed behind you in soft plumes. Somewhere above, a loose clump of snow slid from a branch and fell with a muted thump. The forest was waking from its long night. Every few meters you paused to listen. Safety in snow country depends on awareness. The warning groan of shifting drifts, the subtle crack of buried ice, the quiet whisper of loose powder slipping down a slope. But the morning remained calm, almost reverent. Your body warmed from movement, and soon your coat felt comfortable instead of stiff. You kicked through the drifts, leaving a winding trail behind you. A single set of prints across an untouched world. You glanced back once at the faint hollow that had housed you. It was already disappearing as light and wind reshaped the surface. By nightfall, it would be completely erased, as if you'd never been there. Shelters like that are temporary gifts, fleeting, fragile. But in moments of need, they become the difference between fear and resilience. You pressed deeper into the trees, where the snow lay thinner and the wind whispered less sharply. The world smelled of pine, frost, and distant sunlight. Every step carried you further from danger and closer to the life waiting beyond the ridge. Your breath slowed, your shoulders loosened, and somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice reminded you, survival is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to move anyway. You walked onward, steady and sure. As the morning brightened, you followed the faint line of a frozen creek. The storm had carved strange shapes along its banks, arches of snow suspended like sculpted marble, delicate ridges where the wind had shaved the surface, deep pools of shadow where the world dipped unexpectedly. Every few steps, the crust gave way beneath your boots with a muted crunch. The rhythm felt steady, almost meditative. Your breath rose in soft clouds. You adjusted your pack, letting its weight sit more comfortably between your shoulders. The cold no longer pressed against your skin as sharply. Movement had warmed your core. Still, you kept your gloves snug and your scarf high. Even in calm weather, winter demands respect. The forest around you was quiet in the way only deep snow can command. Sound felt thick, muffled, cushioned by the weight of the storm's aftermath. When a distant branch snapped under the strain of ice, it echoed like a drumbeat through the towering pines. You paused, listened, then moved on. The creek curved gently through the woods, offering a natural path. You stepped carefully, testing each patch of snow before committing your weight. Beneath the surface, Water still ran, slow, cold, barely audible. The thin line of sound guided you forward like a whispered promise of direction. Hours passed in this soft silence. The sun climbed slowly, its light filtered through thin clouds. Occasionally you brushed snow from low branches or sidestepped fallen limbs buried beneath the white. You were alone here, but not lonely. The forest felt ancient, steady, watchful, as if hundreds of snowy mornings had shaped its calm. Eventually, you reached a small clearing where the snow lay smoother and untouched. Sunlight reflected off the surface in a pale shimmer. You knelt, brushing your glove across the crust. A faint wind swept past your ears carrying the scent of frozen bark and distant pine resin. You took a moment to breathe deeply, letting the cold air settle your thoughts. Last night's dugout shelter lingered in your memory. The dim blue walls, the venting snow, the quiet breaths taken beneath 10 feet of winter. You were grateful for it, but also grateful to have moved beyond it. Survival means transitioning from one safe moment to the next, never taking shelter for granted. With renewed focus, you stood and scanned the tree line. The ranger station lay southeast of your current direction, past the rise of a shallow hill and along an old fire road you hadn't seen since before the storm. If the drifts weren't too deep, you could reach it before dusk. But survival teaches that plans are invitations, not guarantees. Something shifted in the air, a softness. A tension, you turned toward the trees and paused. A gentle flutter of snow drifted down from above. Not from the storm, not from the wind. Movement. You narrowed your eyes. A faint indentation in the snow near the edge of the clearing caught your attention. Not quite a footprint, but enough to indicate something had passed through recently. You crouched, tracing the shape with gloved fingers. A hare, most likely, or a fox. The tracks were light, delicate, weaving toward the deeper woods. Nothing dangerous. Still, you listened carefully. Winter hides many stories beneath its surface. You took a final breath of the clearing's stillness, then stepped forward, continuing your journey toward the rise ahead. The world around you shifted slightly. Less storm-touched, more awake. Branches shook off their burden. Birds called from the high canopy, testing the morning air. The forest seemed to stretch after a long night, settling into its natural rhythm once more. You moved with the purpose now, your pace slow but confident. You had survived the storm, you had honored the snow's dangers, and the day, cold and bright, welcomed your steady progress. You walked on. By midday, clouds drifted lazily across the sky. Their shadows moved slowly over the snow, painting shifting shapes on the ground. You climbed the slope leading toward the ridge, each step sinking deeper than the last. The drifts here were fresh, untouched by animals or wind. Your boots pushed through with rhythmic force. Lift, step, sink, rise. The cadence soothed your mind. Fatigue hovered at the edges of your awareness, but you managed it with measured breaths and occasional pauses to adjust your pace. At the top of the rise, you stopped to gather your bearings. The forest stretched wide on all sides, a mosaic of tall pines, bent spruces, and heavy fir limbs weighed down by ice. The storm had transformed the landscape into something dreamlike, beautiful, but treacherous. You unrolled your map carefully, shielding it from the light breeze. Landmarks were buried now, but the contours of the ridge remained familiar. To the south, a winding fire road should run beneath the snow. If you could find its path, you'd cut hours off your travel time. You folded the map and closed your eyes, listening. A soft hush, a distant creak of branches, a far-off rustle of snow sliding from a slope. And underneath it all, the steady patience of winter. You took a few steps forward, probing the ground with your trekking pole. A faint depression revealed itself, the subtle sag where the fire road once lay. Snow had filled its depth, but the underlying shape remained. It stretched toward the distance, a silent guide. You followed it. The road sloped gently downward, leading into a corridor flanked by tall trees. The air here felt different, quieter, sheltered by the boughs above. Sunlight filtered through like soft beams of amber, catching on suspended snowflakes. As you walked, your mind drifted toward the people who once traveled this road. Rangers monitoring wildlife, hikers seeking ridge views, emergency crews patrolling after storms. Now, after the blizzard, it was known only by memory and by those who understood how to read the snow. Your thoughts steadied with every step. This was the path you needed. About an hour into the descent, you spotted something ahead, a curved shape half buried in snow. You approached cautiously. A fallen tree, thick and gnarled, lay across the road. Its trunk was covered in frost, and its branches formed a tangled archway. The storm had ripped it from the ground, leaving a gaping root system exposed on one side. You knelt beside it, running gloved fingers over the rough bark. Nature's weight had been too much. Winter tests everything, trees, land, and humans alike. You circled the fallen giant, stepping carefully around its limbs. The snow here was deep but stable. As you passed beneath the arch of the branches, a soft cascade of ice crystals slipped down, glimmering in the dim light. On the other side, the fire road widened again, guiding you forward. You continued, absorbing the forest's sounds and silences. Winter's morning had softened into a pale afternoon, and the daylight, though muted, carried a faint warmth. You felt something shift inside you, too. Not warmth exactly, but clarity. A sense of direction that wasn't just physical. You were no longer merely surviving the storm. You were moving towards safety. As afternoon settled over the woods, a gentler wind moved through the treetops. Snow drifted from high branches in shimmering curtains, catching the light before dissolving into the air. Your footsteps made soft impressions along the buried fire road, each one marking steady progress. The weight of your pack pressed comfortably between your shoulders. You shifted it occasionally, listening to the faint rustle of supplies within. Food, water, tools, the small comforts that make survival possible. The trail dipped toward a low hollow where the storm had pooled its deepest drifts. You assessed the slope carefully. Deep snow can be deceptive. What looks like a smooth surface might hide fallen limbs, uneven terrain, or even pockets of air created by the storm's shifting layers. You planted your trekking pole firmly. The snow resisted with solid pressure, no give beneath. Safe enough. You descended slowly. At the bottom of the hollow, the world grew quieter. The trees leaned inward, their branches brushing together in soft clicks. The air felt colder here, shadowed by the surrounding ridge. You paused. A faint sound reached your ears. Something distant, rhythmic. Not wind, not an animal, something human-made. You held your breath and listened again. Tap, pause, tap, tap, pause. It was subtle, barely more than a murmur through the snow-heavy air. You moved slightly toward the sound, angling your head. There, the rhythm repeated. A hollow, metallic strike. Your heartbeat quickened, but not with fear, with focus. You tightened your scarf and moved forward with deliberate steps, following the muted tapping. Through the trees, a shape began to emerge. Faint at first, then clearer as your angle shifted. A metal post, icicles dangled from its sides. Snow lapped at its base. The old fire road marker, half buried but still standing. The tapping came again, but now you understood. It wasn't a person, it was the wind. High gusts knocking a loose metal sign against the post. You approached, brushing snow from the weathered surface. The sign read, Ranger Station, 1.5 miles. A relief washed through you, warm and grounding. You weren't lost. You weren't far. You stepped back, letting the wind knock the sign again. The rhythmic sound seemed almost comforting now. You continued along the road. The trees thinned gradually, allowing more light to spill in. The air warmed slightly, and for the first time all day, you felt the sun touch your coat with a faint glow. Shapes appeared in the distance. Not buildings yet, but the line where the forest opened into a wider clearing. The ranger station would stand beyond that space, tucked into the slope. You pressed on, feeling resolve strengthen with every step. The worst of the storm was behind you, but the day was not yet done. You reached the edge of the clearing as the sun dipped toward late afternoon. The sky shifted to soft gold, casting long shadows across the snow. The clearing stretched wide, ringed by towering pines whose branches sparkled with frost. Your breath pooled in pale mist before you, rising into the still air. Somewhere ahead, beneath the ridge's curve, the ranger station waited. But first, you needed to cross the open field. Open snowfields pose unique risks after heavy storms. Unseen dips, pockets of softer snow, thin crust that breaks without warning. You paused at the boundary, studying the surface. The wind had smoothed it into gentle waves. No signs of cracking, no sagging lines, no dark patches indicating thin layers. Still, you tested your path. You stepped onto the field, spreading your weight, planting your pole firmly before each movement. Your boots sank only slightly, a good sign. The snow here had compacted evenly. You walked slowly, feeling the quiet widen around you. The sound of your movements drifted outward in soft echoes, swallowed by the vastness of white. The afternoon light turned the surface into a shifting canvas of pale gold and blue. Halfway across, a distant rumble reached your ears. You froze. The sound vibrated faintly beneath the snow. Not loud, not threatening, but unmistakable. Snow settling. A distant section shifting under its own weight. Not here. Not near you. Somewhere deeper in the forest where drifts lay heavier and slopes steeper. You listened, waiting. The rumble faded. Silence returned. You continued forward. As you neared the far side of the clearing, the shape of a structure emerged between the trees. Low roofline, heavy with snow, dark timber walls half buried by drifts. Relief flowed through you like warmth. The ranger station. You approached cautiously, scanning the building's edges. The porch was buried, the windows frosted over. Snow piled thick along the northern wall, but the structure itself looked intact. You climbed the buried steps, brushing snow from the doorframe. The door resisted at first, frozen, sealed by the storm's weight, but with a firm shoulder and careful pressure, it gave way. Warm, dusty air drifted out, smelling faintly of wood and disuse. Inside, the station felt claustrophobic at first. The windows were small, the room dim, but safety radiated from its stillness. 4 walls, a roof, a place to rest. You closed the door gently behind you, shutting out the winter world. A small lantern hung from a hook on the wall. Spare blankets lay folded on a bench. A metal stove sat in the corner, cold but functional. You set your pack down and exhaled. You had reached shelter. Real shelter. As evening approached, you prepared the station for the night, clearing snow from the vent, checking for drafts, inspecting the stove, melting snow for water. Every task grounded you, reminding you that movement and preparation shape survival. By the time dusk painted the windows in soft blue, a small fire crackled in the stove's center. Heat spread slowly but steadily through the room. You sat close to the warmth, letting your hands thaw. You'd traveled far since the dugout shelter. You'd honored every warning of the snow. You'd reached safety by respecting its weight. Slowly, your body relaxed. The night pressed close, and the fire glowed steady and calm. Night settled over the ranger station with a hush that felt almost sacred. Snow-laden pines whispered outside, their branches shifting gently in the wind. The fire crackled softly in the stove, releasing thin ribbons of heat that drifted into the dim room. You sat beside the warmth, wrapped in a blanket you found tucked beneath the bench. Its fabric felt rough but comforting against your hands. Your boots rested near the stove, drying slowly. Your gloves hung from a peg above the fire, steaming slightly as their fibers shed the cold. You watched the flames dance, your mind drifting like smoke. Your heartbeat slowed. Your breathing softened. The storm felt distant now. The howling winds, the shifting branches, the weight of the dugout ceiling pressing silently above you. All of it seemed like a memory filtered through frost. But survival stories are built on reflection as much as action. You took a slow breath and let the quiet sink in. The ranger station, though old, felt solid. Its wooden beams creaked occasionally as they warmed, expanding from the cold. The sound reminded you of a ship adjusting to calm waters after a rough voyage. Outside, the storm's remnants left the world peaceful. Moonlight filtered through the frosted windows, soft and pale. It cast faint shapes across the floor, long shadows of lamp hooks, the faint outline of the stove, the gentle curve of your pack leaning against the wall. You were alone, but not isolated. The forest surrounded you like an old friend, silent, steady, watchful. You sipped warm water from your bottle, savoring the simple comfort. Heat spread through your chest, easing the deep chill that lingered in your bones. You felt your body relax fully for the first time since before the storm had broken. The dugout shelter under 10 feet of snow came back to you. The blue glow of compressed ice, the narrow vent you'd carved to breathe safely, the careful balance of caution and trust that kept you alive. That shelter was temporary, fragile, and unforgiving. It had protected you because you treated it with reverence. Now, inside this sturdy station, with thick walls and a controlled fire, you felt that lesson settle deeper. Survival isn't luck, it's awareness, it's patience, it's respect for the world's weight and beauty. You closed your eyes for a moment, listening. The stove crackled softly. Wind brushed against the roof. A faint hum from the chimney breathed warmth into the room. You stretched your fingers toward the fire, letting the heat soak into every joint. Your body ached pleasantly, the ache of miles traveled, risks managed, dangers navigated. You had made it through the storm, and now you had time to rest. The fire dimmed slightly. You added a small log and watched flames curl around it, igniting new warmth. The light flickered across the walls, creating a gentle rhythm that soothed your tired mind. You leaned back, letting the blanket gather around your shoulders. Your breathing deepened. The night grew quieter still. Slowly, sleep began to settle over you. The storm was behind you. The snow had calmed. The world felt safe. And as your eyes drifted closed, you whispered a quiet promise to yourself. Tomorrow, you would continue the journey. But tonight was for rest. Morning arrived gently. You woke to pale light filtering through the frosted windows and the soft ticking of the cooling stove. For a few moments you simply lay still, wrapped in the blanket, listening to the hush. No howling wind, no rattling shutters, just the faint creak of warming wood and the distant sigh of the forest exhaling after the storm. Your body felt heavy but rested, the kind of weight that comes after effort well spent. You stretched slowly, wincing at a few tight muscles, then sat up and watched your breath drift in the cold air between you and the window. The fire had died to a bed of glowing embers. Enough heat remained to keep the sting out of the air, but not enough to make the room truly warm. That was all right. You hadn't come here for comfort. You'd come to endure, to learn, to move through this winter with humility. You fed a small piece of wood into the stove, listening as the embers caught and licked it awake. A flame curled around the bark, spreading slowly. The room brightened by a shade. Outside, the snow gleamed. The window glass held a thin layer of frost, but you could still see shapes beyond it. Trees standing silent. Drifts smoothed by the wind. The faint impression of your trail leading toward the clearing. You moved through your morning tasks with steady care. Check your gear. Refill your bottle by melting clean snow. Stretch your shoulders and legs. Inspect your boots, now dry and ready. Every small action was a promise to the day. You would stay present, prepared, deliberate. Eventually, you stepped to the door and opened it. Cold air swept in, sharp and clean. The snow outside reflected the early light, casting a pale glow across the porch. The sky above was a muted blue, streaked with thin clouds. No looming storm. No heavy gray wall of approaching weather. You stepped outside, boots crunching softly against the packed snow. The station sat like a dark island in a white sea, solid and unmoving. The storm had reshaped everything around it, but this structure had held. You looked back once at the doorway. This place had given you something the dugout could not. Time to sleep without listening for cracks overhead. A fire that burned safely behind metal. Space to breathe deeply without watching your vent. But even so, you did not forget the dugout's lesson. Snow can shelter. Snow can suffocate. Snow can save your life. Snow can take it. You knew it would be easy for someone, watching a peaceful video or a calm story, to imagine digging into a snowbank for fun, copying what they've seen. So as you stood there on the porch, you formed the words you'd want them to remember. Never carve deep into drifts without understanding their weight. Never tunnel under unstable slopes. Never sleep in a snow cave without a large ventilation hole and a clear, open exit. Never trust a ceiling you haven't tested again and again. Snow is beautiful. Snow is quiet. Snow is heavy beyond imagination. You turned away from the station and walked into the clearing, each step measured and firm, letting these truths follow you like footprints. You spent the late morning exploring the area around the station, not out of restlessness but out of responsibility. After any major storm, the landscape changes. Trails vanish. Overhangs form. Weak spots hide beneath smooth surfaces. A survivor treats curiosity as a tool. You followed the tree line first, tracing the edge of the clearing. Here, the snow formed gentle slopes against trunks, rising in soft mounds. You kept your distance from anything that looked like an overhanging lip, places where wind could have carved hollow pockets beneath the surface. A misstep there could punch through into a void, leaving you trapped, chest-deep in snow, struggling against its icy grip. The forest itself seemed calmer. Branches shed occasional clumps of snow in soft thumps. A few birds called, tentative but bright. In the distance, you noticed a cluster of tracks crossing the clearing, light and skipping. Rabbit, or perhaps a fox. Life continuing its quiet patterns, even after the storm's roar. You circled behind the station, where the land sloped gently downward. Here, the drifts deepened, piling high against the back wall. You approached with care, probing with your pole. The snow held firm, but the height made you wary. Piled weight against a structure could strain its walls over time. You carved a narrow trench to ease the pressure, lifting snow away in careful blocks. As you worked, you could feel the resistance of densely packed layers, each one a memory of wind direction, temperature, and time. The deeper you cut, the closer the snow's temperature came to a steady, near-freezing balance. This was why shelters beneath thick snow could feel deceptively mild compared to the open air. Snow insulates, but it does not forgive mistakes. You paused to catch your breath, leaning on your shovel. Your thoughts drifted back to the dugout. The low ceiling, the cramped chamber, the vent where you had scraped away a few more inches for safety. Under 3 meters of snow, the temperature may hover around freezing even if the wind above slices it far colder. But collapse that roof or block that vent, and that same insulation becomes a trap. You imagine someone trying it without knowing, digging too large a chamber beneath a weak overhang, sleeping too deeply, not noticing the slow narrowing of their exit, waking to weight and darkness, and no easy way out. You let that image settle, grim but necessary. Then you return to the present, to your trench, to the way the snow blocks stacked beside you, glittering in the light. By early afternoon, you had relieved much of the pressure against the station's back wall. It stood a little freer now, less burdened by the storm's leftover mass. You brushed frost from your gloves and looked out toward the wider forest. The world was still, almost reverent. A moment of pause between weather systems, between trials. A good time to think. A good time to learn. You walked back toward the front of the station, leaving a neat path behind you. Every mark in the snow told a story, where you'd chosen to work, what you'd decided to change, how you'd chosen to meet the world instead of letting it quietly press in. This, too, was survival. Not just enduring, but shaping small things, so the bigger ones didn't swallow you whole. Later, you sat on the porch steps, wrapped in your coat, watching the light soften over the trees. The sky hovered between afternoon and evening, that quiet in-between where colors go pale and shadows grow longer, but the first stars have not yet appeared. Your breath rose in gentle clouds. Your hands rested loosely in your lap. The stillness felt different now, less like the watchful quiet of a storm, more like the deep exhale that comes after it. You found your thoughts drifting outward, beyond this station, beyond this forest, to all the times humans had turned to snow for shelter. Arctic hunters building domes of carved blocks, mountain climbers carving emergency caves into drifts to escape killing winds, soldiers in distant wars digging into winter hillsides just to survive the night. You imagined them lying beneath their own ceilings of ice, listening to the muffled world above. Some of them would have felt awe at the hush. Others would have felt fear at the weight. Most would have felt both. And always the same rules applied. Ventilate. Strengthen the arch. Avoid overhangs. Mark your exit from the outside if you can. Never assume the snow will hold just because you want it to. You pictured a listener, somewhere far from this forest, perhaps in a warm apartment or a quiet bedroom, hearing these words as they drifted toward sleep. You imagined them wondering whether they would ever need such knowledge. The truth is simple, maybe not. Most people will never dig a shelter beneath a storm. Most will never sleep under meters of snow. But survival stories aren't only about literal dangers. They teach you to see weight before it crushes you, to build vents before you run out of air, to recognize when you're tunneling into something fragile, thinking it will hold without ever checking the ceiling. The skills you practice in the cold can echo into every part of your life. You pulled your scarf higher against a small gust of wind and watched the tree line shift, branches swaying gently. The forest had endured the same storm you had. It had bent, creaked, and shed what it could not hold. Now it stood quietly, waiting for whatever came next. You stayed there on the steps until your fingers began to tingle with cold again, then rose and returned indoors, closing the door softly behind you. Night would come soon. There was still more to do, more to think through, before sleep. Inside the station, you set about your evening preparations with the same calm care you'd used the night before the dugout. Only now, the tasks felt less urgent and more like ritual. You stacked a small supply of wood beside the stove. Enough to keep the fire going through the evening, but not so much that you'd be tempted to overfeed it and waste fuel. Fire is a gift, but it consumes without remorse. A good survivor learns balance, enough to stay warm, not so much that tomorrow suffers. You refilled your bottle with freshly melted snow, watching steam rise as ice turned to liquid. You laid your gloves and hat in a dry corner. You shook out your blanket, folding it so it would be easy to wrap around yourself when the light dimmed. The room still smelled faintly of old timber and cooling metal. The stove radiated a gentle heat that softened the chill but left the air crisp. The sky outside the windows darkened by shades, moving from pale blue to muted violet. You lit a small lantern and set it on the table. Its glow layered over the firelight, creating a warmer pool of brightness in the center of the room. Shadows gathered in the corners, soft-edged and harmless. Then you sat, elbows on your knees, fingers laced loosely, and allowed yourself to think about what this experience had really taught you. It had been simple, on the surface. A storm, a dugout shelter under 10 feet of snow, a cautious night, a morning journey, a quiet station. But underneath, it had been a meditation on risk. You thought about the line between bravery and carelessness, about how easily someone could see a snow cave in a video and decide to replicate it without understanding the invisible math of weight and structure, about how survival knowledge isn't just about tools, but about respect for physics, for weather, for time. You could feel the story forming in your mind, even as you lived it. The way you would tell someone that snow can machine, both smother and save, that a dugout must be shallow, stable, well ventilated, that you never, ever dig into the base of a slope where avalanches sleep in layered silence. You imagined yourself back in that blue-lit pocket under the storm's rage. You pictured your gloved hand tapping the ceiling, listening for hollows. You remembered the careful way you carved the vent, the way you checked the exit path again and again. That attention had kept you here, sitting in this station, breathing this warm air, watching the fires glow. You leaned back, letting the blanket slide around your shoulders. The lantern's light flickered across the ceiling. Outside, the forest exhaled as night settled fully into its branches. You were safe, but you would never let that safety make you forget what it had cost to earn. Later, as darkness wrapped itself fully around the station, you opened the door once more and stepped out into the night. The world had transformed. Moonlight poured over the snow, turning it into a silver sea. Trees cast long shadows, sharp and black against the glowing surface. The sky shimmered with distant stars, clear and cold. The storm's memory had been burned away by this quiet brilliance. You stood there, feeling very small and very alive. Your breath rose in pale clouds that glowed faintly before fading into the air. The snow beneath your boots glittered with 1,000 tiny reflections. The silence felt deeper now, layered with the soft ticking of cooling branches and the distant whisper of wind moving high above. You took a few steps away from the station, just far enough to see it from a distance. The building sat half sunk into the snow, its roof lined with frost, a faint warmth visible in the soft light around the windows. It looked like a lantern anchored to the earth. Behind you, your trail from earlier marked your passing in gentle lines. Beyond that, the forest stretched into darkness. You thought about the dugout again, buried somewhere back along your route, now likely erased by wind and drifting snow. No sign would remain of the place where you had waited, listened, and breathed beneath 3 meters of winter. Shelters like that are meant to vanish. They belong to the storm as much as to you. Standing under the stars, you whispered a few simple truths into the cold. Never dig blindly. Never trust untested snow. Never forget how heavy the sky can become when it falls in flakes. Your words vanished into the air, but they stayed with you. You turned back toward the station, your boots crunching softly in the moonlit snow. As you reached the door, you paused one last time to look at the forest. It watched you without judgment, holding its secrets in branches and drifts. Then you went inside, closing the door with a gentle finality. The night wrapped itself around the building. The stove burned steadily, the lantern glowed. You settled into your blanket again, knowing that sleep would come soon. But even as your eyes grew heavy, you understood that this story wasn't just about one storm, one dugout, one shelter. It was about learning to see danger and beauty at the same time, to feel awe without losing caution, to find peace inside a world that can be harsh and unforgiving. You breathed in, you breathed out, and the snow-covered forest listened in silence. You woke before dawn, but only just. The world outside was still dark, wrapped in the quiet blue that comes before sunrise. The stove had burned low, leaving the air in the ranger station cool again, but not bitter. You sat up slowly, listening to the faint ticking of contracting metal and the soft rattle of ancient timber adjusting to the cold. For a long moment you simply breathed. No wind, no storm, no distant cracking of settling snow. A different kind of silence, one shaped by peace rather than survival. You rose and stirred the fire back to life, feeding it slowly. Flame bloomed behind the stove's small window, washing the room in soft orange. Your breath no longer clouded in front of your face. Warmth crept into your fingers. Once you had packed your gear, you stepped onto the porch and let the dawn air touch your cheeks. The horizon glowed faintly, a thin line of muted gold spreading across the edge of the world. The snow caught the first light in a way that felt otherworldly, as if the entire landscape were holding its breath. You began walking. The goal today wasn't distance. It wasn't danger or endurance. It was something simpler. Understanding the land after the storm, feeling its new shape. Letting your mind settle into the lessons the night had taught you. Your boots sank softly, no longer battling the thick drifts of yesterday. Wind had carved smoother surfaces. Sunlight from the previous day had crusted the top layer just enough to ease your steps. You followed no specific trail at first. You moved intuitively, letting the forest guide you. A slight incline led you to a ridgeline where the trees parted into a natural overlook. From here, you could see the storm's full footprint, a vast, sweeping blanket of white rolling across hills and valleys, smooth and unbroken. The world felt untouched, like a blank page waiting for the next story to be written. You stood there for a long time. Each breath warm in your chest. Each heartbeat slow and steady. The weight of yesterday's storm falling away like loose snow from a branch. You thought about the dugout under 10 feet of snow, that fragile chamber of ice and stillness that had held the night around you. It hadn't been a home. It hadn't been a refuge of comfort, but it had been enough. Enough to save you. Enough to teach you. Enough to remind you that survival never asks for perfection, only presence. You turned away from the ridge and continued walking deeper into the forest, letting the soft sound of your footsteps blend with the waking world. As the sun climbed, shadows shortened. Small details emerged from the snow, rocks half buried, the tips of dormant shrubs, the outlines of fallen logs hidden beneath powder. You navigated between them carefully, always mindful of what lay beneath the surface. Winter is honest in its harshness. It hides nothing maliciously, but it hides everything. You crossed a shallow dip in the landscape and noticed the faint tracks of an animal weaving between trees, precise, delicate, purposeful. You followed them for a short distance, not to hunt or chase, but to understand. The tracks belonged to a fox. Its steps were narrow, evenly spaced, never sinking too deeply, a perfect example of instinct refined by generations of living with snow. The fox had crossed a narrow log and continued toward thicker brush. You paused at the log, brushing snow aside. Underneath lay a small hollow where cold air pooled. Had you stepped there without testing, your boots might have plunged unexpectedly. Not dangerous today, but a reminder of the thin lines between security and uncertainty. You moved on. Later, you reached a grove where the storm had sculpted extraordinary shapes. Arches of layered crust, small waves frozen mid-crest, a peculiar hollow where wind had scoured the snow down to the forest floor. You crouched beside it, running your gloved hand across the exposed earth. The smell rose faintly, soil, rich and frozen, holding the memory of last autumn. Beneath the winter, life waited patiently. Snow pressed heavy above, but the earth endured, quietly, steadily. You thought again about the dugout, the delicate balance of safety and danger, the way you had listened for cracks, tested the ceiling, maintained the vent. Many would see only the beauty of a glowing snow chamber. Few would understand the risk. You whispered into the quiet, "Respect the wait." The forest didn't answer, but it didn't need to. The meaning was already woven into the cold air around you. You returned to the ranger station by midday. It sat peacefully among the trees, its roof glimmering under the sun. From a distance, it resembled a tiny cabin adrift in an ocean of white, a refuge earned by careful steps. Inside, you removed your pack and set it against the wall. The fire had cooled again, so you fed the stove another small log. Orange light filled the space once more. Then you sat, not from exhaustion, but from contemplation. The storm had been a trial. The dugout had been a breath held beneath a crushing sky. The forest had been a lesson written in ice and silence. Now you had a moment to reflect on everything the experience had carved into you. You thought about the pressure of the snow above you, how even several feet of compacted flakes held the weight of stone. You remembered the muffled quiet of the dugout, like being submerged beneath a frozen ocean. You remembered carving the vent wider, feeling the ceiling with careful hands, knowing that collapse meant suffocation. You remembered the way your breath fogged against the lamp's glow, the warmth of melted snow in your bottle. The moment you decided that fear didn't define you, awareness did. You leaned back against the wall, feeling the warmth of the fire settle into your bones. The station felt almost like a sanctuary now, not because it was grand or luxurious, but because it represented a place reached through knowledge and perseverance. You hadn't stumbled into it. You'd earned it. For a long while, you simply sat and watched the flames. Shadows flickered across the floor. The room hummed softly with the settling of wood. Your breath fell into a peaceful rhythm, slow and steady. Eventually, you realized something. Even as the storm had forced you inward, turning the world into a tight circle of light and snow, it had also opened something in you. A space for clarity, reflection, understanding. Storms strip away the excess. They leave you with what matters, and what matters is rarely loud. Afternoon turned to evening again, but it did so gently this time, a smooth transition rather than the abrupt darkness of the night before. Soft pastel colors smeared the sky beyond the frosted windows, pale lavender, muted rose, hints of amber fading into blue. You stepped outside once more, wrapped in your coat. The air felt cold but kind. The storm's harshness was gone, replaced by a calm hush that lay over the forest like a blanket. You walked a slow circle around the station. Each footstep left a crisp imprint in the snow. Birds flitted between branches. A squirrel bounded across the surface, moving lightly, perfectly adapted to the crusted top layer. Life had returned to the forest, not loudly, but confidently. You found a small rise just beyond the clearing and climbed it. From there, you could see further. Hills rolled away in a gentle sweep. Trees cast long shadows. The sky reflected off the snow like a second horizon. You sat on the rise and pulled your scarf higher, watching the last traces of daylight sink behind the ridge. The world softened. Sounds dimmed. Your thoughts grew slow and warm. You thought of others who might listen to this story, by people far from the cold, far from the forest, listening in their rooms or homes, wrapped in blankets, drifting toward sleep. You hoped they would remember the beauty of snow, but also the truth of it. Snow is light as a feather until it gathers. Then it becomes a mountain. You hoped they would feel the calm of the station, the glow of the fire, the hush of the night, but also the warning: never underestimate winter. Never dig beneath a drift without knowledge. Never trust a dark hollow without testing. You closed your eyes and let the world breathe around you. When you eventually rose and walked back toward the station, the first stars had begun to appear. They shimmered faintly above the treetops, cold and distant but steady. You stepped inside, lit the lantern, and settled down for your final night in this small, wooden sanctuary. The journey had changed you, subtly, deeply, quietly. You felt grateful, you felt humbled, you felt ready to rest. Night embraced the forest one last time. You sat close to the stove, wrapped in the blanket, letting the fire's fragile glow wash over you. Your breath was steady. Your mind was calm in a way that only comes after the world has tested you and found you willing to listen. This was the place where reflection lived. In the quiet after the storm, in the warmth after the cold, in the stillness after the wind had screamed itself empty. You closed your eyes and let memory drift through you. The dugout under 10 feet of snow, the faint blue light filtering through the ceiling, the careful scraping of a vent that meant life, the distant howl of the wind above, the gentle fear that sharpened into caution, the morning light that signaled survival. You carried all of it inside you, not as a burden, but as a map, a reminder, a quiet truth. Nature is powerful. You are small, and yet with respect and understanding, you can endure even the heaviest nights. You thought about how storms become teachers, how snow becomes both a blanket and a warning, how stillness can reveal what rushing never will. Eventually, you rose and opened the door. Moonlight spilled across the clearing, bright and silver. The snow reflected it like a mirror. The trees stood tall and dark, their branches etched with frost. The world looked infinite and peaceful. You stepped outside one last time. The cold hugged your coat. Your breath drifted upward in pale wisps. Your heartbeat thudded softly in your chest. And there, beneath the stars, you felt something settle deep in your bones. You had survived not because you fought the storm, but because you learned to move with it. You turned back to the doorway and whispered into the quiet, "Thank you." Not to the storm, not to the shelter, but to the part of you that had listened, learned, and stayed present. You stepped inside again, closing the door gently. The fire crackled softly. The lantern glowed. Your body relaxed fully, ready to drift towards sleep. And before your eyes closed completely, you offered one last thought to anyone listening. Good evening, and thank you for spending this night here, in the snow, in the storm, in the shelter of a quiet forest. If you're still awake to hear these last words, tell us in the comments, what would you like to survive next? Don't forget to like the video if you enjoy what we do here, and subscribe for more survival stories. Until next time, stay warm, stay safe, and remember, even the quietest night can teach you something if you're willing to listen.